All right. So welcome to everybody who's at the Housing California Conference, both those of you who are in person in the Sacramento. It was nice to see a number of you both in the conference hall and also after hours last night. And also welcome to those of you who are out and about in other parts of the state or even outside the state who are joining us virtually. It's kind of nice to be able to do both this time around. So you've chosen this panel on addressing segregation and unequal access to opportunity in California. Sort of where are we, and more importantly, where do we go from here? We're really going to be talking about the state's efforts to affirmatively further fair housing in California. And I think many of you are well aware that this has been sort of a legal requirement for some time. It's taken a renewed push in the last probably 5 years as we'll kind of talk about the history of that a little bit. And I think especially in the last year or two, as we focused more and more on equity, it's gotten ever greater importance. And so this is a topic that is very timely. It's one that has been long overdue, I guess I would say, and one that I think we are all looking to sort of make progress in. And when we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, I really think it encompasses two aspects that we are all really trying to reconcile. And the first is, how do we create opportunity for low-income families in areas where there is higher opportunity, but historically have been exclusive and not allowed lower-income persons, particularly persons of color, to reside in. But there's a second aspect of it that is equally important, which is how do we revitalize those communities that are suffering from lack of investment, that have high concentrations of poverty, that tends to be fairly dominated by racial aspects as well. And this is an area where we have all fallen short, and I think we are all committed to that as well. So it's really this both and approach that we were talking about. How do we create opportunity, create choice, and how do we open up choice in neighborhoods that already have opportunity, and how do we bring all neighborhoods up to an acceptable level and a thriving level of opportunity? So that's what we're here today to do. We have a number of panelists. I will let them introduce themselves in just a second. But we're going to do a little bit of the history of affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations, a little bit about sort of where we are today, some research that the California Housing Partnership and UCLA have worked on, talk about sort of what some of the state agencies have done as a response to sort of these legal obligations and research trends that we've seen. And then we're going to talk about sort of what comes next. And we have a special presentation from HACLA in Los Angeles that is working on a voucher mobility program. We have some comments from a practitioner in the field who's spent his career building affordable housing and revitalizing communities. And then we're going to finish off with HCD is actually now coming up with an opportunity framework project to further these discussions further. And we'll hear more about that from HCD. So with that, I'd like to each of the panelists to just introduce themselves briefly. And Tyrone, can I start with you?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tyrone Buckley. I am the Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at HCD. My unit, I run the Fair Housing Unit. Our unit is housed in the Housing Policy Development Division.
Great, thank you. And Don?
Hi, I'm Don Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Community Housing Development Corporation. We're located in Richmond, where we work throughout the Bay Area. And I'm also the co-chair of the Black Developers Forum.
And maybe just a sentence or two, Don, about some of the developments that you've worked on that bring you into this space.
Yeah, so we worked on a lot of community-based developments. We've spent a lot of time in basically collaborating with different services, organizations, and just making sure we have residents in the room whenever we're talking about anything. Very important that we get buy-in from what we're doing, but also all stakeholders in the room. And so that process has been successful on a number of communities. I am kind of glad to see that it may be a trend that will be taken off if it has the proper I guess, will to do so. So I'll leave it right there.
Great, thank you. And Margarita, a little bit about not just where you are, but how you come to this issue personally as well.
Sure. Margarita Lares, I'm the Chief Programs Officer at the Housing Authority of the City of LA, commonly known as HACLA nowadays. I'm responsible for public housing as well as the various rental assistance programs such as Section 8 as well. I've been here for about 3.5 years, but prior to that, I worked 20 years with the County Housing Authority, which is the Los Angeles County Development Authority. So I've been in the business for a very long time. We've had an opportunity to apply for a mobility demonstration program utilizing our voucher, housing choice voucher program. It is a joint program with the County of Los Angeles, and you'll hear more about that. So that was the first initiative that I took coming to HACLA and using my connections, obviously, with my former housing authority, working together. My personal interest is really what has led me to take on this initiative. You know, I was born and raised in Los Angeles in a very segregated neighborhood. I am a product of the Los Angeles Unified School District. I went to school in the 1970s, graduated from high school in 1983. So a lot was going on in the 1970s. So a lot of personal interest for me, more so than professional. Thank you.
Great. And I'm Marc Stivers with the California Housing Partnership, Director of Advocacy. And while some of you may have seen me on other conferences over the years, it's probably a little known fact that I actually started my career in the field of fair housing. The first 5 years of my career, I worked with nonprofit fair housing organizations in Hayward and Oakland, and working on housing discrimination cases. I was the person who trained testers who went out then and posed as renters and the investigations of the complaints that we received. And I worked on quite a few, both administrative complaints and actually lawsuits that regarding discrimination cases, and worked with clients through the years, followed them through that entire process. And so that was kind of my start in housing in a lot of ways. And I feel like a lot of the work I did in the legislature with housing element law was also really directly related. It was trying to get each city to zone for its share of affordable housing and you know, create opportunities for people to have choice in where they live. So it's a sort of a different level. It's not so much the individual cases, but more at the kind of the 10,000 foot level. But I felt like all of that has sort of been an extension of my original career. And then as we moved into state agency work, kind of implementing some of the affirmatively furthering fair housing principles at TCAC or even at HCD has all been another extension of that. So I'm very pleased to be on this panel as well and share it with such distinguished guests. So if our tech folks can line up the PowerPoint, we're gonna have a bit of a presentation here before we get more into the discussion. And Tyrone is going to start us off once we have that PowerPoint up and running. So Tyrone, to you.
Great. You can go ahead and take us to the next slide. I am, again, Tyrone Buckley. I'm at the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'll say, along with everyone else, since folks have been sharing a little bit about their personal connection to the work, you know, I also have a personal connection like Margarita. I grew up in a struggling neighborhood here in Sacramento that was in the 80s and 90s that was really struggling with gangs and drugs and was in challenged schools and all the things that we know are in challenged communities. And I actually was bused across town. I think I grew up at the end of desegregation in Sacramento. I was bused across town to a better school that my mom had to camp out in front of to get me into. And, you know, for an hour and a half a day across town. And I always credit that as part of my success in life. So access to opportunity, access to good schools, to good resources is something that's near and dear to my heart. First, a little bit about the HC Fair Housing team. I just want to let you all know a little bit more about it. We've had the HC Fair Housing team up and running for about 3-4 years now. I'm the second person to run that shop. We deal with all kinds of issues, from fair housing issues, from tribal inclusion issues. We also help update the opportunity maps and do the opportunity-based work. Accessibility issues for folks for people with disabilities, and implementation of new laws around AFFH, one of which we'll talk about today. As you've probably seen, HCD has been hiring nonstop in the last few years, and my team has grown from 3 people to 11 people ultimately when we fill up all of our spaces. So a lot of expansion, a lot of resources being invested into affirmatively furthering fair housing and making sure HCD is doing our part. Also, thank you, Housing California, for accepting our proposal for our presentation today, and CHPC for putting it together. Today, I'm going to discuss AFFH and HC's vision for AFFH. While the work of the department has always been deeply connected to addressing fair housing issues, our efforts have become much more intentionally focused on addressing racial equity and broadening access to opportunity within the last few years, in part due to the passage of recent legislation, which we'll discuss today. First, I'm going to discuss AFFH and a little bit about the history there. And later on in today's presentation, as Marc mentioned, I'll talk about our expanded work on access to opportunity. So, you know, I think as many of us are aware, but I'll just say out loud, for most of our country's history, practices such as overt and covert housing discrimination through restrictive land use policies, systemic redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and private land sales. I have one in my house. It's on my deed here in Sacramento. Biased mortgage lending practices, patterns of investment and disinvestment. All these things restricted access for many Americans, particularly Black Americans and Latinos, from accessing opportunity and meaningful fair housing choice. So to address these longstanding discriminatory issues, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, also known as FHA, in 1968. Established shortly after the assassination of Dr. King, the FHA housing discrimination prohibited housing discrimination based upon race, color, religion, and national origin. The act was later amended to encompass discrimination based on sex in 1974, as well as disability and familial status in 1988. It's important to highlight that the Fair Housing Act mandates that we need to go beyond prohibiting housing discrimination, but further to creating meaningful opportunities for real housing choice through affirmatively furthering fair housing. And in two separate provisions, the law requires that the federal government affirmatively further fair housing. The first section of the act requires that HUD administer the programs and activities relating to housing and urban development in a manner to affirmatively further the policies of the FHA. And the second mention imposes an almost identically worded obligation on other federal departments and agencies. Unfortunately, the act did not define AFFH well, and that job has been left to the courts over the years. Next slide, please. So nearly 50 years after the Fair Housing Act became law, under the Obama administration, HUD issued a new rule in 2015 that provided a very strong definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And in 2019, California adopted that definition and put that into our fair housing law. The federal rule was modified in 2020 under Trump, but has been at least partially reinstated under Biden, under the Biden administration. So going to the definition, affirmatively furthering fair housing means taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. And then the definition goes into giving us clarity on what meaningful actions are. And meaningful actions taken together would address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity, replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. The definition embraces a wide variety of strategies to address access to opportunity, not just expanding access to opportunity-rich places, but also looking at place-based strategies to make sure that community development occurs in communities that are low resource. Next slide, please. So despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act and related civil rights laws, sustained political will, as has been mentioned here today, has never really materialized in a way that keeps pushing forward the efforts to meaningfully reduce residential segregation and mitigate its negative effects. And there are consequences of this inaction. A recent study from the Othering and Belonging Institute found that racial segregation has remained high and even increased in the metropolitan areas in California since 1990, further entrenching racial and ethnic inequalities and access to important neighborhood level resources and opportunity. There are a couple quotes on this slide as well. The first is from Republican Senator Edward Brooke from Massachusetts, who served, I think, from 1967 into the late 1970s. He's the co-author of the Civil Rights Act and gave us the Brooke Amendment that capped tenant income in public housing to 25%. I actually put in a newsletter once that the Brooke Amendment capped tenant income in public housing to 30%, and Mike Harold over at Western Center on Law and Poverty quickly let me know that in fact it was Senator Brooke got us to 25% of tenant income, but in 1981 it was expanded to 30%. And so Senator Brooks' quote, "Segregation is so widespread and so deeply embedded in the national psyche that many have come to regard it as a natural condition," which I think is, something that we certainly struggle with today. We talk about de facto versus de facto segregation versus de jure by law segregation, and sort of these conversations about, where folks would like to live. And then the second quote, which really resonates with me and I think is really speaks to this moment we're in now, which is, "We as a country rediscover segregation and its enormous human cost every decade or so, only to conclude that it is too intractable or questionable to tackle with serious resolve." And it is. It feels like every few years we sort of have this Notebook moment where if you've seen that movie where the person sort of comes out of the fog and recognizes that we have a deep problem, and then we just never really get to the point where we're ready to tackle it. So that's just to give you a little bit of a sense of where we stand today to help ground today's discussion. And now I'll pass it back over to Marc.
Great, thank you. If you can advance to the next slide. So we're going to talk now a little bit about some research in this area and looking at sort of the LIHTC portfolio, the low-income housing tax credit portfolio, and where we stand today. And for this research, I want to give a lot of credit to Dan Rinsler, who's in the research division of the California Housing Partnership, and who I also want to thank for helping us organize this panel and dreaming it up to begin with. And he partnered with Professor Jose Loya at UCLA to do a lot of analysis and put out a paper on this fairly recently, from which we take a lot of this information. But if you look at where we have funded low-income housing tax credit development serving families since the onset of the program in 1986, it is very marked that LIHTC homes are disproportionately located in poor segregated neighborhoods and underrepresented in higher resource areas. And if you take a look at this chart, if you combine the two bars on the left, you see that 60% of LIHTC family units have been in the lower opportunity tiers, according to the TCAC HCD opportunity maps, and only 18% have been in the higher two tiers. So in essence, affordable housing is 3 times more likely to be in an area of lower opportunity than in higher opportunity. And again, that affects tenant choice, right? If you're a low-income family looking for a place to live, there are just very few opportunities in the high opportunity community. Affordable housing is generally concentrated. Next slide, please. And it's not just by area of opportunity. This chart looks at sort of how LIHTC developments are located in terms of segregation patterns. And it also shows that LIHTC homes are disproportionately located in communities of color and unrepresented and segregated white neighborhoods. So you see in the second bar there that highly white communities have been very successful in keeping out essentially affordable housing. There is, a significant portion of the census tracts fit into that category, 16%, and only 5% of all the low-income housing tax credit developments are located in such communities. Again, looking at the bar on the left, those developments are much more likely to be in an area of high segregation. Next slide, please. And this directly affects opportunity. If you're just looking at the residents of low-income affordable housing, if you are a white resident of low-income housing, you are way more likely to be in a higher opportunity area than any of your counterparts. The bar on the left shows that, and I think I'm having a hard time reading the number as I get old, but I think it's 30%, 20, and probability there. And of course, people people of color, particularly Black residents, have the least likelihood to be in a high opportunity area, but all persons of color come in at a lower probability of living in a high opportunity area when they reside in affordable rental housing. And there's a lot of things that go into that. Obviously, you know, people have choice. Some live in certain communities for cultural reasons, political reasons, and others. But again, the idea in part here is that the opportunities just aren't always there equally for all people. Next slide, please. And in this slide, affordable housing in higher resource neighborhoods is associated with greater access for low-income Black and Latinx families. And so this gets to the idea that there are people who do want to move to opportunity. It's not all self-selection, definitely not self-selection that is coming in with these results. We find that affordable housing developments that are in higher opportunity areas have a much higher proportion of people of color living in the units than in the surrounding community. So they are sort of a way for people to access opportunity. Placing affordable housing in higher income communities does create those opportunities. Next slide, please. So this is the data that I know when I started TCAC in 2015, I found pretty compelling. And I got a big push from Ben Metcalf, who was then director of the Department of Housing. So I give him some credit as well to really think about how could we reverse some of these trends. And again, not that the idea would we would put all new affordable housing into higher opportunity areas, but how do we seek to start bringing the pendulum back to sort of the middle? And it sort of really has catalyzed some of the thinking at the various state housing agencies that are involved. So, you know, it is not just the legal mandates to affirmatively further in fair housing. That was one impetus for these changes. Also, just sort of the mounting evidence that we had about sort of where we had located affordable rental housing for families over the last couple of decades. And we also, there's been new evidence on location preference and why segregation persists. Research has shown that high levels of segregation persist largely due to barriers to choice rather than reflecting the preferences of people of color. Next slide, please. Which takes us to sort of where we are today. TCAC probably took the first step in terms of trying to increase the number of developments that are located in higher opportunity areas. There were really three changes that were made in the 9% low-income housing tax credit competition. The most important was that there was a tiebreaker advantage instituted for family developments, new construction in higher opportunity areas. They were also given an easier path to scoring maximum site amenity points, and they were also given a threshold basis limit increase boost, which has a couple impacts, including makes it a little bit easier to pass the high cost test, and would have resulted in somewhat higher developer fees as well as an incentive. In the last year, SIDLAC has followed suit. They also had a tiebreaker adjustment, but the main driver in the SIDLAC competition was an extra point, sort of a bonus point for properties that are located in highest opportunity areas. There were some easier paths to getting maximum cost containment points. And I like to kind of distinguish the TCAC and SIDLAC approaches in that TCAC, I think, took a fairly gradual approach. The tiebreaker incentives were meant to be significant, but not determinative, meaning that higher opportunity area developments were not necessarily automatic winners. SIDLAC last year, with its bonus point, essentially kind of made higher opportunity areas automatic winners, and I think drove a lot of people to thinking that only higher opportunity developments would be successful in the future. And I think they are looking at sort of backing off that a little bit and sort of turning off that extra bonus point when 50% of the bonds are allocated to higher opportunity areas. So again, we get back to that both and approach. And then now MHP, the state's multifamily housing program, is also sort of moving into this realm. It's giving higher per unit subsidies for projects in higher opportunity areas. It's granting local housing need points, leverage points, and adaptive reuse points as well. So there are various ways that higher opportunity developments are advantaged in the HCD programs now as well. Next slide, please. And we are starting to see some of the results of those changes. Whereas, before 2019, 4% of affordable homes were built in the highest resource areas. That has moved up to 16% in the last 3 years. And again, what we're trying to find here is, the way I think of this is balance. We're trying to not swing the pendulum too far the other way. I think of the goal as sort of parity across all opportunity areas, that we have a sort of an equal amount of affordable housing in all opportunity areas. And I think you'll see that we have some way to go here, but there's been some pretty significant changes in the percentages since we started some of these incentives in 2019. Next slide, please. And this is a study. This was a chart that came out of the study by CHPC and UCLA, and it looks at sort of, if the goal is parity over time, how long will it take us to get there, and what sort of, how far beyond parity do we have to go in the short term to get to parity in the long term? And again, this kind of harps back to this idea that TCAC has taken a little bit of a slower approach. CIDLAC took a little bit of a faster approach. But again, if looking at the middle of this chart, if 50% of the state resources went to higher opportunity area developments over time, that it would still take many decades, 7 or more decades, to be able to sort of get to that parity level. Obviously, that percentage increases. The number of years it takes to get there goes down, and the lesser advantage we give to higher opportunity projects now, the longer it would take to actually achieve that goal. But that's a policy decision, and we'll get back and have a lot of input from the community here, our audience, in terms of how we think that approach is best done. At this point, go ahead and do the next slide. I think that takes us to Margarita. Oh, no, one more. We've been talking here a little bit about how we improve the siting of affordable housing into areas of higher opportunity. But again, the notion of this panel is that it's a both and approach that we are all committed to. And the idea is to, as Tyrone read from the definition, is to have all areas of opportunity, have all areas of our communities have a high level of opportunity. How do we bring everybody up? And there are some federal resources that are now committed to those types of initiatives. The Choice Neighborhoods is one that works at reinventing public housing. Promise Zones are another. But as we know, these programs are limited and highly oversubscribed. And at the state level, currently, we really don't fund a lot of place-based initiatives. We have one known as the Transformative Climate Communities Program through the Strategic Growth Council. But for the most part, the state has not yet chosen to invest in a comprehensive way in areas to bring them up to a standard of opportunity. And that is something that I think all of us need to double down and work on a little bit more. Going to the next slide, please. So we're going to switch gears for just a second here, and Margarita is going to talk about the Community Choices Demonstration Program that HACLA has been engaged in. And again, it's another way of trying to increase opportunity for low-income residents. So Margarita.
Thank you, Mark. So how do we take some of the ideas that were presented by Tyrone and Mark and bring them to fruition, right? We take the vision and we put it in practical sense. The Housing Authority of the City of LA, jointly with the Housing Authority of the County of LA, the LACDA, we had an opportunity to work on this initiative. We started the process in 2019 in anticipation that there would be an opportunity to apply for a grant to HUD. And there was word that HUD was thinking of issuing a NOFA, and we waited and waited. But while we were waiting, we started to sort of plan and put together a model of a potential program. I have to share with you, if the NOVA had never been released, we were still intending to figure out how to do this. So we were obviously very committed to this concept. And fortunately, the NOFA was released and we applied jointly and we were awarded. We were one of 10 grants that were awarded. You do have some vouchers that come along. It's a very small number of vouchers, and mobility vouchers of 74 for both housing authorities. However, we are required to commit some existing vouchers. So for a total of almost close to 2,000 vouchers. What makes these vouchers unique is they do come with mobility related dollars. $4 million was the award that was given to us. And there's an opportunity for additional monies in the new federal budget. It is a 6-year program. Year 1 is the planning stage. We are currently in that year 1 planning stage, and we intend to roll out the program by August 1st of this year. One of the benefits of this particular program is that there will be a lot of research involved with it. Years 2 to 6, we will be focusing on recruiting and enrolling families that are interested in living in higher opportunities. The families will be divided into a comprehensive mobility services, which I'll talk about a little bit later what those are, and then selected mobility related services. We think that this pilot program will make the future of mobility, and it's a good starting point to alleviate the difficulties of securing quality and affordable housing while facilitating moves to higher opportunities. This is a voluntary program, and it's intended to give choices to those that are interested. So it's very important for me to stress that. Next slide. And there's a lot of partners, obviously, starting with HUD, our primary funder of this program, the LACDA, which is the County Housing Authority, HACLA, and the 2 consultants that are under contract with HUD, First Pick, as well as Abbott. And they have also partners that will be the researchers as well. Next slide. You know, the foundation to this program and why HUD was interested in moving forward with it is because there were already 15 existing programs across the country. One of them that has been written up a lot is the study that was done with Seattle and King County. It's called the Community Moves to Opportunity, also known as MTO. And I've given you here in the slide the link for reading the research study. The research study was headed up by Raj Shetty team and a lot of folks, and it's really good reading. And I mean, it really solidifies what we all think in theory should happen when we move children to higher opportunities with better schools. The results are very positive. As I indicated before, there were 10 agencies that received the award, Los Angeles being one of the main ones that received the funding. The study for the 10 awardees, there's an official name that has been given by HUD, and so you might want to remember that. It's the Community Choice Demonstration. So going forward with any write-ups, any communications in regards to this program and the funding will be referred to as the Community Choice Demonstration. And that's how we're going to market it with our prospective participants in the program. Next slide. Expected outcomes. The obvious one and the initial goal is to expand housing choice for participating families. The long-term goal is to improve the education, health, and quality of life of participating families. And the longer term, which is my passion, is to further the both housing authorities' mission of expanding affordable housing, ending generational poverty, and empowering people to achieve their highest potential. Next slide. I thought you'd find this map interesting. This map shows the concentration of the current voucher holders in Los Angeles. The Housing Authority of the City of LA has about close to 51,000 vouchers. We are, I believe, now the second largest voucher program in the country, with New York, NYCHA being #1. 64% of our voucher holders reside in poor, low opportunity communities, of which 71% of those have children under the age of 18. And in addition to that, the County Housing Authority has about 25,000 vouchers. 41% of them reside in poor and low opportunity, and which 45% of them have children under the age of 18. And the reason why we're focusing on children, all the red dots you see in this map will show exactly where those households are living. There's a high concentration in South LA, Southeast LA, East LA as a whole, and the Antelope Valley up in the what we call the desert, high desert area of Los Angeles, still within the county of Los Angeles, but huge concentration in those particular communities. I happened to grow up in East Los Angeles, the zip code 90022. Anywhere where you have consecutive zeros kind of means something. You know, you learn to understand that if your zip code has consecutive zeros, it's probably not a high opportunity area. We landed in Los Angeles. My father came to California as a migrant farm worker in the late 1950s. We landed in East LA because of someone that he met in one of the farms, had family there, and had a room for my father to stay. I shared with you that you know, we've stayed. My parents still live in the same home after all of these years and raised 6 kids there. My parents never went to school. And for them, the fact that their children were not involved in gangs in the 1970s and then were going to school was good enough. So when there was an opportunity of possibly going through the desegregation program from the LA schools that they were required to offer, that was kind of late for me. It was already in my high school years. And my parents just were fearful of putting a child in a bus to go across town to an unknown community, away from our culture, right? So for that reason, I do understand the benefits of doing the and in both, and how we have to tackle segregation from a mobility program, but also a place-based type of initiatives. And I'll talk about that as well towards the presentation. Next slide, please. So this map is what we would like to see. The white areas are presently where we have our voucher holders, which is the communities that we have spoken about. The green areas, or the darker green areas, are the higher opportunity areas where we would like to give our voucher holders an opportunity to reside. Those are communities like, and I'm gonna just go ahead and list them by name. Some of you might be surprised when I list these names, but these are the communities of La Cañada, La Crescenta, Diamond Bar, Walnut, Claremont, let's see, Calabasas, Valencia, you know, all the really good neighborhoods we hear about on TV, right? And why not? Why can't we make this dream come true? These were selected with the help of HUD's consultants using various opportunity maps, which I think many of you are familiar. Tyrone spoke about that, Marc spoke about that. The study, the UCLA study, has a lot of that information, really focusing on education. And really the well-being of the child, looking at indicators like education, looking at such as 3rd grade reading, 3rd grade level mathematics, you know, are their children testing at the appropriate level in those school districts, looking at health and environment, access to green space, social and economic factors, such as even home ownership. You know, what is the rate of home ownership in that community? There are 718 census tracts in Los Angeles that are designated high opportunity, right? The white color areas I've already told you is where we might have a concentration. To be honest, I think I read one of the comments in the chat, you know, how do you deal with people not in my neighborhood? Well, I'm going to say this here very bluntly. Our typical Section 8 voucher holder looks like Tyrone and Margarita, right? And I think we did okay. I think we've done okay. And why not give an opportunity to more children like Tyrone and Margarita? Next slide. And how are we going to get there? Well, we got to enrich the program, right? The typical voucher on its own just are not going to do it for these communities. Recruiting landlords that are interested. We are strongly considering multiple ways of payment, you know, moving beyond the typical payment that the Housing Authority is doing, and working with the consultants now to determine if we can even consider doing small area FMRs based on zip codes, right? We are waiting at this point for the release of the new FMRs, which are generally issued late September, early October. And then on that basis, then we can run some analysis to see what would be the appropriate payment standards. We're doing cash incentives so that the families have money for deposits. You know, how many of us have 2 times the rent in cash in our bank account to pay a deposit of maybe $4,000? Very few people have that kind of disposable income. So security deposits, maybe even utility startups as well. So we are exploring all of that with the $4 million that we received from HUD. This program comes with services. This is essential for this program to be effective. And we are actually contracting the mobility related services, understanding that the housing authorities do not have this area of expertise. We know how to process applications and issue rent payments, but not provide counseling services, either pre and post movement counseling services and coaching, sitting with the family and making an individual plan as to what is their interest in, what community, what goals are they trying to reach, and helping with the housing search process as a whole, inclusive of transporting individuals to look at rental units that are available in an unknown community, of course, right? And the amenities that are available, including schooling and employment and church services and support groups and so forth. Happy to hear that the new federal budget provides additional money for this program. So it does demonstrates that there's a political will to continue to do this with the current administration. So we are actually very excited that the support continues to be in the program. Next slide. So just to recap on where we are with the mobility program, we've completed the planning. We are hopeful with the support of all of our partners that we will be launching the program August 1st. We have already started to reach out to our families on our wait list that have children under the age of 13 for interest already. And age 13 is we've decided is a good start so that we give the children a good 5 years to track their success. From children at the age of 13 are generally under 13 starting like 7th grade, sort of that middle year, continue to middle school and then obviously high school. And if we're not able to get enough interest from folks that we are bringing onto the program, we can move to existing families, and we are allowed to invite existing families with children under the age of 17 as well. But ideally, we want younger children coming into the program, but we can do a combination of both. So I'd like to give updates on this. I think we are looking forward that 5-6 years from now, we can also issue a very positive report as the one that has been issued for Seattle and King County. That said, I did want to spend a little bit of time to talk about, other initiatives that the Housing Authority of the City of LA has had a wonderful opportunity to do. We've started really on this venture of redeveloping our public housing sites. And we started out with Jordan Downs, which is in the Watts community. And we were also given an opportunity to apply and were awarded $35 million of choice neighborhood initiatives, and another $33 million from the state of California through the Transformative Climate Communities as well, and $5.4 million in community block grant dollars as well. These funds will be used to implement 30 projects in the community of Watts. Jordan Downs sits in the community of Watts. These projects cover a significant range of activities from urban greening, transportation, expansion, street improvements, business development, and of course, the construction of new affordable housing at Jordan Downs. That's a multi-phase, multi-year development of public housing. We are kind of on a roll and would invite everybody that is in the LA area to come visit. We've already planted like 4,000 trees. We've added some new streets. We already have about 400 converted public housing to affordable and market rental units. It will also include a total of 1,300 units. So we actually moved from 700 public housing units to 1,300 public housing units. I'm sorry, I keep saying public housing, but affordable and market rent combination units. New retail spaces up and running. Finally, there's a supermarket in the Watts area. That has always been an unknown. We have some retail stores like Nike and Ross, and other stores are coming. We have a new park, and there are plans for additional parks coming in the future as well. And obviously that is over years, but we are very proud that we've completed the first year of some of this transformation as well, and appreciate all this funding that came our way as well. And since we've been doing so well with the transformation of Watts, we also applied for a transformation plan for the San Pedro community. And for those of you that are not familiar with San Pedro, that's actually where the Port of Los Angeles is located. A community that has a lot of freeways, as you know, nearby. You have the port, you have a lot of truck routes, a lot of rail. There's a lot of poor quality of air issues, as well as with Watts. We were awarded a $950,000 planning grant, and it does include with plans to redevelop 478 public housing units, also for affordable and market rent as well. And a lot more to come from that perspective. These are examples of how HACLA is considering the both and as well. What of our goals? Our goals are really to improve the quality of life and prevent displacement when we consider the projects that we're doing in Watts and San Pedro. And I think that's my final slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. That really is, you really are walking the talk down there. There really is the both and approach in many ways. And I know that I was able to visit the Jordan Downs development a couple of years ago. It was already impressive what was going on down there. I think I'm overdue for a visit to see the almost final product now, right?
Please do, please do, yes.
So Don, I'd like to turn to you now for just a moment, and two things. One, if you have any reactions to the study that was presented, to the comments of any of the panelists to date, but I'd also like to, we touched on briefly that, there aren't a ton of resources at either the federal or the state level for true comprehensive community revitalization. And I would really like, kind of as someone who practices in this area as well, what would be most helpful to really get at the multi-sector approach that deals with not just affordable housing, but the complete needs of a community in terms of achieving opportunity?
Sure, thank you, Mark. Well, let me just say, I charted my background a little bit. Just want to let you know that I'm a native of Oakland. My dad was in the politics as well as in the NAACP. We continued. My mother was involved as well. Just our whole family has been involved in basically civil rights and just causes. So it's not a mistake that I got into this line of business because it felt really good to my soul. And so I just stayed in there. I really like the Margarita, your initiative that you're doing. I think in a lot of terms, it's an example of what can be done in a collaboration effort. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, how we look at the process of comprehensive community development. But want also to let you know that we are really walk the talk as an organization, as a comprehensive community developer. We have several lines of business, and we lend not only for real estate, but also for economic development opportunities. We provide home buyer counseling for rent and ownership, and as well as down payment assistance. We have a property management arm. Of course, we have a real estate development arm. We do rental and home ownership developments. We think that's important to have both of those in the community. Also, directly community engagement. We want to empower the folks that are in our community and give them resources and opportunities to express what they want in their communities. We even do down payment assistance on cars and homes and hybrid type of cars that affect the the environment, asset management, and we are a CDFI. So we also have a great depth of resources that we can use in communities, but we know that we can't do that all alone. So having said that, let me move into what I wanted to talk about a little bit, and that is the most communities, and it might not be all of them, but they work in silos. I mean, you have housing operations. You've got silos within there. So you've got homeless, you've got multifamily rental, you have senior, you got SROs, you have just conventional ownership, you have land trusts, you have cooperatives, you have special need, and of course the local housing authority as well. But then you have economic development nonprofits or organizations that deal with local hiring. You deal with skills and technical training, small business, entrepreneurial, job placement. Focus. A lot of them focus on exposure to career opportunities. And then of course you got education. First 5, childcare, K through 12, magnet schools, special focuses, initiatives for school programs. You have the college aspirations. You have your junior colleges, you have your 4-year colleges, and then you move on to health. I mean, access to health care, mental health care. You have addiction services. You have the environment there with the asthma and lead stuff that's in our environment, leaky underground tanks and other pollutants and contaminated sites. But you also have that other part, which is community engagement, where you have your churches, you have your community and neighborhood associations for civil causes and equity, systemic racism issues, and various forms of advocacy and community organizing that are taking place. But then all these different silos, then you have your state, federal, and local jurisdictions, and they mimic all the different silos that you see, and they operate usually within those silos, and they fund accordingly. And that other one may not see what the other one doing a lot of times. So it's very siloed. And the real need when you're talking about comprehensive community development is a real collective effort to identify values and things that you can combat together. And if you don't have the resources to do it, then you look for those resources to bring into your fold. So, because you have to figure out, like how are services being evaluated, and what's being done now, where are the gaps in services, who will lead, who will fund it, who will do what, do what when, and what kind of timeline is that on? Who's committed, and what form of that commitment are you going to get? How is the plan incorporated into the systems that that you are involved in? How do you influence those jurisdictions, those NOFAs, those RFPs to align with what you're trying to do? And it doesn't really grasp unless you have that depth in commitment. So, first of all, you got to make sure that, it should support, the contingent of these comprehensive plans that address multiple objectives, stakeholders, residents, providers, workers together and agreeing on a comprehensive community development plan. That plan should be agreed upon by jurisdictions and counted on based on promises and commitments that are real. And these plans will provide the foundation for philanthropic resources to garner. It will also, it's something that is done over time. You don't think that you're going to get this collaborative together all at once, but it's going to form and shape, and it's going to grow, and some of your objectives will vary, but you have to revisit them to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Now, that's a simple thing to say, but relationships matter, and political will matters. And that's where the community engagement really plays a big part, because we have to have, folks are used to doing stuff the same way they have. And in order to break that trend, you gotta be able to show the strength in a collective effort. And I think what Margarita showed before, that sounds like a collective effort in that form. And I think that by really doubling down on the commitment and making sure you get input on what's there, because everybody just needs to work. We just want to try to get folks to work together. And some folks, some communities will be able to have more resources than others based on the appetite of where it is at that particular time. Some folks are doing some forms of this, but they have not really got more involved in it in a way that is more impactful. I think this is the improvement of the future, because there's no one source anymore. You know how collectively we try to layer different things together. We're going to have to look at that when we're looking at communities. How do we layer those different resources, or how do we use each other's resources to get to the whole picture? It's hard work, but after it gets going, it can be really, really successful. So that's the skeleton and bones of comprehensive community development.
John, just one question before we move on, which is, as you've done your community development efforts, have there been state programs that you've relied on mostly that have been most helpful? And I know from our perspective in the Peanut Gallery, it seems like the Transformative Climate Communities program that Margarita mentioned is the one that seems most comprehensive in really addressing a variety of needs and bringing a community up to opportunity. Have you looked at that program? Has that been a model that you like? It's not quite there yet either.
Well, I mean, I think they're all good models, but I think there has to be the will of a community to come together to actually think about how they're going to do this. Now, there may not be a ton of resources there, but when you come together and it becomes more of a campaign of what you're going to do, and it kind of builds that momentum if you got a collective audience. Obviously, with the resources, there used to be redevelopment agency, right? We know that used to be there. That could have been a driving force. But we've already doing a lot with less. But I think that to get to the more, we have to have that collective plan of what we need to do. And I think that is what's going to generate the momentum, not just from the local governments or jurisdictions, but the philanthropic community. Folks, when they see you're doing something and you're moving, you can compel or at least make that an attractive investment. And I think that's what the term is, investment, because that is what we're looking for, that return that is not always based on a loan.
Great, thank you. We're going to come back and have more of a discussion on some of these topics. But before we do that, Tyrone, I just want to turn back to you and the last few slides here, and that HCD is about to embark on a new opportunity framework project, and to delve into some of these issues further. And can you tell us what's in store? And you can go to the next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Mark, and thank you, Don and Margarita, for those great presentations. I enjoyed them thoroughly. It's great to hear about the great work you're doing, and it actually dovetails a little bit into what HCD wants to do going forward. Since I've been on at HCD, the interest in opportunity policies to advance AFH has really grown significantly. When we were first doing this, we had the opportunity maps, but we've seen more and more folks try to incorporate those maps into other policy areas. They're And that's a bit of a challenge because they're designed for a specific purpose around the TCAC program, around families with children. And so, we have been thinking through, all these different places that the opportunity maps have started to get incorporated. A couple of places that really have stuck out for us where we're seeing some pressure is that the legislature has been advancing proposals to include opportunity framework in land use decision making in the last few years. We've seen a couple of bills come out. This hasn't manifested in new laws yet that incorporate the opportunity maps, but we anticipate the discussion is going to continue in the legislature, and we want to start thinking about that ahead of time. Ultimately, the legislature is going to continue to be focused on seeking bills that are inclusive of equity issues, and the opportunity maps seem to be the shortcut that they engage in to get there. Second, as we mentioned a little bit before, there have been passage of laws in the last few years that mandate the inclusion of affirmatively furthering fair housing in the housing element process and in the regional housing needs allocation process, or RHNA process. New housing elements are required to include an analysis of fair housing and programs and actions that affirmatively further fair housing. And the regional housing needs allocation process requires that methodologies now have to affirmatively further fair housing as one of the statutory objectives of those methodologies. So that's a pretty big change in land use policy for the state. And really, we've seen, my unit looks at the RHNA process pretty closely. And we've seen that really jurisdictions have been leaning pretty heavily on the opportunity maps to do that kind of analysis. It's not the only thing they've looked at, but that's been a big part of it. And then finally, and Marc mentioned this, we're seeing increased inclusion of AFFH scoring metrics in affordable housing funding programs. So as we saw this real interest in AFFH gather, we wanted to take a moment and step back and consider this increased interest. And it became clear to us that we need to develop a broader framework that is inclusive of all the constituent parts of the definition of AFFH that we all looked at together earlier. We need to not just look at mobility strategies, but we need to look at place-based strategies. We need to look at addressing segregation, addressing displacement, all of those component parts of the definition that are in law now. And while we always understood that AFFH is much more than mobility strategies, we acknowledge that the opportunity maps, our best developed tool so far to AFFH, was primarily a tool to identify high resource areas that could enhance the life outcomes of low-income families and children. Mobility strategies are not the only pathway to affirmatively furthering fair housing. I say that out loud because I think in the last year or so, folks have wondered sort of where HCD and the state stands on that. And I just want to say that we really do recognize that we need to engage in the other components of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And we need to build out a research basis and strategies and tools to AFFH through community development, anti-displacement strategies, desegregation strategies, all those component parts to lift up communities that are struggling and then build out important resources in those areas. And that has to be part of the state's strategy to AFFH. And so to that end, we are beginning a process this year to bring more stakeholders to the table. We did a lot of engagement when the opportunity maps were first created, but we haven't sort of broadened that stakeholder table. And so we want to do that this year to help us build out research supported strategies to AFFH in all the areas that we're called upon to engage. We're calling this Opportunity Framework Project. The project will take a step back and seek to answer the following questions. What role do mobility strategies play? Marc kind of talked a little bit about that, about what are our goals there when it comes to mobility strategies. What role do place-based strategies play in the state's role in AFFH? What strategies exist outside of the funding sphere? Where do mapping tools fit in? What other tools are necessary? And how can the state measure and evaluate its progress on AFFH? So our hope is that through this project, we will be able to expand our community development strategies and policies, our desegregation policies, our displacement policies, all those component parts of AFFH, without offsetting the progress we've made in recent years towards funding more housing in high resource areas. Next slide, please. Great. So in order to answer these questions, we plan to conduct, with the support of the Fair Housing Task Force, which helps us update the opportunity maps, helps us create and helps us update the opportunity maps every year. We want to conduct a mixture of research, policy analysis, and stakeholder engagement. Our first step will be conduct a landscape analysis that outlines the current AFFH related policies and programs that exist in California. We've mentioned a few times today, the TCC could be, it may be one of the only community development focused programs that we have at the state level as far as funding programs go. This analysis will help us identify areas where the state's AFFH approach could be refined or expanded. Second, we plan to convene a series of stakeholder engagement conversations, and this is really the meat of it for us, to solicit feedback from experts in the field on how the state should AFFH. I will go into more detail on our plan of these conversations in the next few slides. We will also rely on the task force to review existing literature on AFFH, community development, and other related topics. We want to, as much as we can, steep this in research verified strategies. And I'll just say as an aside, research doesn't have to be, we don't have to find research for all the strategies that we determine we want to engage in. I came up working on environmental justice, and we would often get feedback from folks as we are advancing environmental justice policies that, there wasn't enough data to demonstrate that we need to keep this community safe from this particular toxin. That's not the approach we want to take at HCD with looking for new tools. We don't want to let the research basis be a thing to hold us up, but wherever we can really sort of demonstrate that we know how to change families' lives, we want to step into that strongly with a research basis. After conducting the information gathering and analysis, we will work to develop a comprehensive stakeholder informed policy framework for how the state can affirmatively further fair housing. Once a framework is complete, we will work to refine existing AFFH tools and identify new tools that are needed to implement this policy framework. Next slide, please. All right, so types of questions we're asking. We've been working to develop a pretty detailed list of questions that we want to make sure are answered. But I'm including a few examples to give you a better sense of the project's focus. So first, what is the ultimate goal of mobility strategies? This could be in the context of both the KECAC portfolio or the housing element site inventory. For instance, we want to explore what portion of newly funded housing we want to see located in higher resource areas each year. Marc showed us that great slide that demonstrates how long it would take to create balance by putting low income housing in high resource areas. So we want to interrogate that further and understand what real policy goals should be. We want to make sure we have a clear vision for what we're hoping to achieve through this policy and clear strategies to get there. We also want to look more closely at, what does a research-based approach to community development look like? We feel comfortable with our understanding of a strong research basis behind mobility strategies, but we want to get a better understanding of what research-based approach to community development and the other components of AFFH would look like. Next, we want to look at what sorts of resources promote positive outcomes among different demographic populations. For instance, immigrants. Right now, the maps, as I've said, are really focused on understanding the resources that children need to be successful. But different demographic groups may need different resources, immigrants, seniors as some examples. So we want to start looking at what access to opportunity means for other populations. We want to look at how the state can do more to promote AFFH through land use policy. We want to make sure to make this a broad inquiry around what it looks like to AFFH across many different policy areas, including housing elements and the RENA process. And then finally, we want to look at how we can refine our existing mobility strategies and ensure that affordable housing located in high resource areas actually reduces segregation. There's been recent research that we've talked about a little bit already indicating that White folks may be more likely to live in affordable housing located in high resource areas compared to other racial groups. So we want to explore what policies we could pursue to ensure that mobility strategies have the impact that we intend. Next slide, please. All right, types of stakeholders we're going to engage. This is a place where, we've done some thinking around this, but we would certainly love folks' feedback. First, we plan to engage with the affordable housing development community, both the for-profit and nonprofit, regionally and locally. We want to bring in researchers who are experts in AFFH, segregation, community development, land use, and other key topic areas. Next, we want to ensure we incorporate the voices of residents, both those who are living in historically disinvested in areas and those who live in affordable housing located in higher resource areas. We want to understand, for residents living in historically disinvested areas, what kind of investments in their neighborhood would they like to see? What do they want a community development program to look like? And then for those living in high resource areas, we want to know more about what their experience has been like, and if there's anything we can tease out about how mobility programs should be refined in order to improve outcomes, similar to the type of exploration that Margarita is engaged in. Along the same lines, we'd like to engage neighborhood-based community groups that are made up of and understand the needs of local residents. And we want to engage entities that have successfully engaged in community development in the past, folks we can learn from, like folks on this panel. That could include cities, state housing agencies, HUD staff, or nonprofits implementing community development programs on a local level. We'd like to engage both equity advocates in California and fair housing experts and scholars. And lastly, we want to engage city and regional planning staff. Next slide, please. So here is an overview of how we plan to structure the stakeholder engagement. First, we want to have some initial conversations just with developers who have been part of this conversation already through the funding programs. We want to understand, we already know that some developers are frustrated with how the TCAC and HCD opportunity maps have been applied. And we want to give them a chance to help us understand their concerns up front. Next, we think it would be useful to have a large town hall with all stakeholders develop a shared vision of what AFFH should look like in California. We have heard from stakeholders that in general, there's a lot of alignment at a high level, meaning that people agree on the need for AFFH policies and the general goals of these policies, but the disagreements really start when you get into the nitty-gritty details and implementation. So we think it would be useful to bring folks together to help highlight areas of alignment, create a sense of common purpose. Next, we'd like to organize a set of smaller targeted conversations with individual stakeholder groups. We definitely want to learn from these conversations. We recognize the stakeholders we're planning to engage have valuable expertise, and we want to gather their feedback. And we want to do so in a way that allows us to really absorb as much information as possible and really dig into the areas where they have a lot to share. And we're thinking that maybe we do some small focus groups as a tool to do this. And we also know that the feedback we've gotten so far is that we should really have an iterative process. We'd like to have multiple touch points with these focus groups and participants so that we can have a chance to report back to them what we've learned and give them a sense of the direction we're heading, and then allow them to provide additional feedback. And then lastly, our goal is to create a policy framework that can be implemented at the statewide level, both across different divisions of HCD and across housing agencies. So given that, we want to make sure that we create an interagency working group comprised of entities that would have a role in implementing the framework, with the idea that if we convene this group every quarter or so, keep them updated on the goals and progress we're making, we should be able to create some buy-in on the final policy. Next slide, please. All right, so the timeline. This is one of those projects that has the the gift and the curse of not having a statutory deadline. We have been progressing, I think, at a good pace, and these are really goals for us this year. This year, we've done some planning and scoping already. Since September, we've been working on planning the project, working with the task force on trying to sort of create some shape and form around it. January through October of this year, we're going to conduct that stakeholder engagement. We're planning to start conducting the stakeholder engagement soon, hopefully in late April, early May. Given there are quite a few different groups we want to engage, and that we're planning to have a somewhat iterative engagement process, we're expecting the stakeholder engagement to run through October of this year. At around the same time, we're also going to be engaging the task force in that research and information gathering phase that I talked about earlier. We want to start looking into and broadening our academic understanding of all these different component parts of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And then after we've gone through that research piece, gone through the stakeholder engagement, we want to start developing our policy framework. And we expect to have it finalized around January of 2023, and that'll allow us a few rounds of revision. I'll say that we do also recognize, though, that there will be a lot of interest in seeing how this process can inform the funding programs that are going to be updated this year. So we have an eye towards that too, and thinking about those deadlines for things like TCAC and SIDPLAC. So occurring concurrently with all of this will be the update of the TCAC HC opportunity maps. We're hoping to have gathered enough information through this project to make some revisions to the maps by the end of this year. However, we recognize that some of the changes that we identify as necessary may take some time to implement. And since the task force generally starts prepping for the map updates in the second quarter of each year, some changes may need to wait to be implemented in the 2024 round of revisions. And we also recognize that not everything that we build out through our stakeholder process and our research is going to result in changes to the maps, right? Some of those things will be other tools we need to develop in order to inform the program. So we want to be open to that as well. And then in February through May 2023, the task force will identify further map revisions needed and develop additional tools. We plan to have the task force take some time in February or May of that year to identify any additional map revisions that are necessary in 2024 and to work on developing any additional tools or resources that we identify as being necessary. One other thing to note is that we know it's a long timeline, and we don't want to wait till 2023 to start applying what we learned from this project. So we'll be keeping that in mind as we go through this process. There are a couple of major state initiatives that we're keeping track of, whether it's long-term RENA reform or the annual update of the maps, to make sure that our process can inform those things as well. Next slide, please. And just briefly on, next slide. The project, there we go. Briefly on the project outcomes. This is really what we'd like to achieve. We want a stakeholder-informed policy framework for how the state can AFFH. We'd like to develop new publications and online tools that can support implementation of this framework. We would like to develop a plan for how we can revise the TCAC HC opportunity maps if needed, as well as how to apply them in other policy contexts or what other maps might be needed to be useful in other policy contexts. And then lastly, we would like the task force to help us develop materials that respond to policy conversations that emerge throughout the course of this project. So whether it's new legislation or other issues that come up through the course of the project, we are going to be, we want to be able to issue memos that apply an AFFH frame to new funding programs or legislation. So with that, that's what we're going to be engaging in this year as the next step on AFFH. We're excited about it, and that's it.
Thank you, Tyrone. And this is the point where we welcome your questions and comments. I encourage you to use the Q&A box. We would love to do this in person and whatnot in a more dialogue fashion, but due to the wonders of modern technology, we will use the Q&A box. But Tyrone, your presentation is, I think, a perfect segue to the question that Regina Celestin Williams from SV at Home posed, which is, how do we include the community voice and our residents in shaping these policies, especially the state's efforts to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So it sounds like you're going to have a very robust sort of stakeholder engagement that will include both from the developer side, the resident side, the community voices. I think hopefully that gets somewhat at her question, but also I imagine that both within the HCD programs, the multifamily housing program and others, as well as at TCAC and SIDLAC, that we'll have each year still discussions about the opportunity maps. It sounds like maybe at the end of this year, 2022, we're more likely to have a more significant revision to the opportunity maps. And that, we will, and I think in the next month or two, we're probably going to start talking about the SIDLAC regulations, which will again address this issue of, at what point do we turn off the bonus point for high and highest opportunity developments and whatnot. So hopefully there will be many public engagement activities throughout, but it sounds like yours is the most comprehensive of that nature. So thank you for that. Couple other questions that have come in here. I think one was posed in the chat quite a while back by Christina Navarro. How do you convince communities to support affordable housing when so many have a not in my neighborhood mentality? And I'd encourage any of the panelists here to sort of jump in, but I know from my work in the legislature that we rely a lot on kind of state laws to ensure that each community is doing its fair share on the affordable housing front. And while not perfect, housing element law that your division oversees, Tyrone, ensures that cities zone land for all income levels, including higher density multifamily. I think the new AFFH rules that apply to that housing element law will ensure that they're not all in lower opportunity areas of a city, that they'll hopefully be spread out throughout a city. And then we have statutes like the Housing Accountability Act that say that if a development is proposed on a site that identified the housing element, that a city's ability to deny that development are severely limited, and they have to have very objective findings that meet one of very 5 narrow reasons. So hopefully, I think we all have a long way to go in terms of creating these opportunities and dealing with NIMBY resistance in exclusive communities. But I think these laws are meant to break that down. And I just know from my experience at TCAC and SIDLAC, and that we seem to be generating quite a few developments in higher opportunity areas. And I think with the incentives, I think there was actually a sentiment among the Affordable Housing Committee last year that we were creating, there were going to be too many, right? We were going to overwhelm the SIDLAC process with high opportunity developments. And so hopefully we can make some progress there. Question for, I don't know, any of you here. It comes from Calvin Whitaker, a former colleague of mine, but when we have people of color who have moved out of sort of historic neighborhoods, particularly in the Bay Area, moved out to the Central Valley and whatnot, as we create these new housing opportunities in higher opportunity areas, is there a way that we can, is there any thought about enticing folks who have already left the community to come back and take advantage of those opportunities? Tyrone or Dawn or even Margarita with your, your moving to opportunity sort of programs. Is there any thought along those lines?
I'm going to just respond in very broad. I think that even when people move, they always have ties to their original community, right? And so we may be residing in a new community, but we still have family, we still have friends. And so potentially even, church and so forth and other organizations. So if an opportunity came in the future where there is new development in that community, I think that people would be open to that. I don't think there would be a lot of enticing that would need to be done. And again, that's not a theory, that's just my personal opinion on that. I personally had an opportunity to move to a different community, but I still spend a good percentage of my time in my original neighborhood because my parents are still there. And I would, if there's, I would welcome an opportunity to move back if it made sense. So.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit that usually you find that situation with gentrification, right? They can't get back in, really that happens quite a bit. And then that is that aspect of when you talk about improving, lower resource communities, and if you make that trend, you have to have a balance there of what you're doing. If a person is in a already high resource area, I think that's the salient thing, right? So I think that they would already be in a place that would be okay. But my more concern is I still haven't seen anything that talks about that there's recruitment required, that you go into those areas where there are low resources and you do a real campaign to make this property known, its availability. You not only just say that, you talk about what are the benefits that you're trying to get to and what this opportunity could mean to you. And I think you employ the churches. I think you really get down grassroots with it to make sure that what you're trying to do is known and they can know the benefits that you think that they will get from it. And so I think that has to be marketed and touted very highly and on a grassroots level and in all in the community. So I would also say that you should probably look at giving some kind of points to those folks so they will have a better or more of an opportunity to get there. There should be some kind of way that they will not just be on the list with everybody else. And I don't know that that's there or not. I'm just talking what I'm thinking about, but I don't know if that's in that already. But I think that could help if you're really talking about moving a person into a higher resource area and you really want to get those that are in there. You really have to do some things that is going to really double down on that happening.
Yeah, I like that point. I do think there's a lot of room for that sort of to be the next phase of the HCD and TCAC SIDLAC systems of, I think Dan's data shows that low income housing has a better integration than the communities, the higher income communities in which they're located. But I think we could do a better job of affirmatively marketing and, creating those opportunities. I think that would be probably a next phase of regulation. So getting the developments to exist in the first place is maybe phase one, and making sure that we're really truly affirmatively marketing them as a good phase two. Marguerite, I want to come back to one question that we had talked about sort of in our pre-meeting, which was what feedback have you gotten from voucher holding families themselves about their interests and motivations in accessing your program and moving to opportunity?
Oh, a lot of interest. We've already reached out to everybody on our wait list, and with sort of an introduction to the program, we're seeking interested households, and we've been bombarded with inquiries of when is this going to roll out, how much money will be available to make it feasible for me me and my family to move. So there is definitely that interest. I think that all studies will show is that everybody wants to live in a good neighborhood, with a good health system and good education, and that's even our voucher holders, right? Mm-hmm. So the interest is definitely there.
So it sounds like you might you have to ration some of the resources you have in this program, and you may be oversubscribed, as it were, by families wanting to participate.
Yes, potentially, yes. However, we've been instructed by HUD to don't be too concerned with that. Everybody wants this program to be successful in Los Angeles. Huge metropolitan area, obviously. And there might be an opportunity for additional funds that are not used in other communities.
Great, thanks. And Tyrone, do you want to take the question in our Q&A about when will the HD statewide racially concentrated areas of affluence map be released, and maybe just say a moment or two of what that is?
Sure. So we put out our guidance around the new fair housing law that impacts both AB 686, which impacts both the housing element process, make sure that you have to look at AFFH in that context, and then also affects public entities. And they have a mandate if they have a housing or community development program to AFFH in those programs. So, sorry, just real quickly. So what we did is we put out a guidance to that new law in, I think, last April. Time is a flat circle in COVID. And so we also put out a data viewer to help jurisdictions be able to look at their community with different pieces of data in order to help satisfy that housing element mandate in particular. And so what we've been working on is adding this racially concentrated areas of affluence map to the data viewer. So another thing you could toggle on or off, everything on there sort of things you could toggle on and off. And the idea behind racially concentrated areas of affluence is that, you know, oftentimes when we think about segregation, we think about in terms of racial enclaves of people of color in poverty, sort of the recap approach. This flips that on its head a bit and looks at racially concentrated areas of affluence. So basically places where you see large contingencies, often of white folks, that are also very sort of high resource, and have a lot of affluence, and looking at those areas as areas that we want to focus on in order to address exclusion. So that's the goal there. We have been working on different metrics of how exactly we want to frame that. You know, what's the income level that signals affluence? What's the level of whiteness, or is it you know, maybe two races that are dominant in an area that would make this map work? So we're still working that out. I think you'll see it before the middle of the year, though.
Thank you. And we are just a little bit over time, so I'm going to end the last one with a lightning round question for our panelists, which is, I think you saw in the research that CHPC and UCLA did, that chart about how many years it will take to achieve parity. There's wide divergences. The state essentially is looking to a percentage of what percentage of resources does it want to see go to higher developments and higher opportunity areas to kind of get to parity over time, while maintaining the both and approach. And so 50% has been thrown out there, but so the lightning round question to each of you is, what percentage would you pick? Don, let's start with you.
Say that again, what percentage I would pick of?
Yeah, well, so what percentage of affordable housing resources would you dedicate to higher opportunity area properties? If 40% of census tracts are higher opportunity areas, and we want to get to parity over time, what percentage today do you think of each year do you think should go to higher opportunity area properties?
Well, I think that I like the 50%, but I like the 50% of how do I put it, resources in both directions. I mean, yep. I think that's what I would like to see, because I think one area may take longer than the other. And I think that you can't turn your back on communities in a way, and you have to double down on both of those areas. So 50% is what I would say.
Okay, well, Margarita.
I would second Donald's recommendation.
Okay, Tyrone.
I don't think I can give a percentage without getting in trouble.
Yeah, government employee. I get it.
I will say that I really am attracted to sort of breaking out of that construct a little bit and thinking about how can we actually capture community development and investment in low resource areas that is actually lifting up resources and creating more high opportunity areas. And I'd love to see that acknowledged more in our funding programs.
Great. Okay, with that, thank you all. I want to thank the panelists very heartily, both Margarita, Don, and Tyrone. And again, a big thank you to Dan Rinsler, who helped us dream this up and put this together and do a lot of the research. And we will all see you at the next steps of affirmatively furthering fair housing in California. And we will welcome the larger group participation. So thank you all. Have a great day. And thanks for sticking with us to the end of the conference.
Thanks, Mark.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care.